My wife whispered. Don't cry now that you'll need those tears when I take the house. Her lover giggled. And the car. Her mother smiled. And your pride. The judge opened my envelope. Read. Then laughed out loud that my wife blinked. What's funny? The judge only said, Karma, daughter. True revenge story. Let me start with this. The courtroom was colder than a mother-in-law's hug. And trust me, I knew exactly what that felt like because mine was sitting 3 rows behind my soon-to-be ex-wife, staring daggers through my skull like she was trying to set me on fire with pure contempt alone. But here's the kicker. While the room temperature hovered somewhere between meat locker and Antarctic winter, my palms were producing enough sweat to solve California's drought crisis. I'm talking full-on Niagara Falls situation happening in my hands. And of course I was wearing my best suit, the Navy one I'd saved for job interviews and funerals, which was fitting because this divorce hearing felt like both simultaneously. I sat there in the defendant's chair, or maybe it was the plaintiff's chair. Honestly, I'd stopped caring about legal terminology around the time my lawyer told me I was probably screwed, but let's see what happens. Which is exactly the kind of reassuring legal advice you want when your entire life is being dissected in front of a judge who looked like she'd rather be literally anywhere else. My dignity was hanging by a thread thinner than the lies my wife had been feeding me for the past year, and that thread was fraying faster than my sanity. Across from me sat Talia, my wife of 5 years, though wife felt like a generous term at this point considering she'd spent the last 6 months treating our marriage vows like a rough draft she could edit at will. She looked like she'd just won the lottery, and in her mind, she probably had. The winning ticket was my life, neatly packaged and ready to be split down the middle, with her taking the bigger half, because apparently that's how divorce math works when you've got a shark for a lawyer and the moral compass of a parking meter. Right beside her, practically glued to her shoulder like a barnacle on a yacht, sat Adrian fucking Prescott. Yeah, I'm using his full government name because that's what he deserves. Adrian was her office friend. And I'm using the heaviest air quotes imaginable here because calling Adrian her office friend was like calling the Titanic's maiden voyage a minor inconvenience. This guy wore a smirk so wide you could park an 18-wheeler in it. The kind of smirk that said he knew exactly what he'd done and was proud of it. Like a toddler who'd just successfully used the toilet for the first time, except way more infuriating and significantly less endearing. Behind them, sitting like the queen of a kingdom built on lies and Botox, was Veronica Chen Richards, my mother-in-law and certified nightmare fuel. This woman had the same frozen smile she'd worn at our wedding, the one that never quite reached her eyes and always seemed to say my daughter could have done better, without her having to actually move her lips. Thanks to enough cosmetic work to fund a small country's GDP, her face had the mobility of a department store mannequin. But her eyes? Those eyes could cut glass. And right now they were cutting straight through me with the precision of a laser-guided missile. Judge Patricia Lynn sat at her bench looking like she'd seen this exact circus about 7,000 times before and was thoroughly unimpressed with our particular performance. She was flipping through files with the calm detachment of someone who'd spent decades watching adults act like petulant children fighting over who got the good toy, and her expression suggested she'd already mentally checked out and was probably planning her lunch order. My lawyer, Theodore Marks, call him Teddy, he'd said during our first meeting, though I'd started mentally calling him Teddy the Ineffective, sat beside me looking like he'd already written my obituary and was just waiting for the right moment to deliver the eulogy. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry bees, and somewhere in the back of the room, a clock ticked loud enough to remind everyone that time was money, and we were burning through both at an alarming rate. The court reporter's fingers flew across her little machine, probably typing something like, "Another idiot getting divorced, Tuesday edition," and the bailiff stood by the door looking like he'd rather be directing traffic in a hailstorm. That's when it happened. The whisper heard round my world, the moment that would have broken a lesser man, but instead just added fuel to a fire that had been building for months. Talia leaned toward me, close enough that I could smell her perfume, the expensive kind I'd bought her for our anniversary, naturally, and her lips, painted that specific shade of red that screamed warning sign to anyone with functioning eyesight, curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles were designed by people who'd never experienced joy. "Don't cry now, Marcus," she hissed, her voice dripping with so much fake concern it could have flooded the room. You'll need those tears when I take the house. Adrian, because of course he couldn't resist joining in like the third wheel he'd become in my marriage, actually had the audacity to chuckle. Not even a quiet chuckle, but a full-throated laugh that echoed in the otherwise silent courtroom. And the car, he added, like he was reading items off a shopping list. My car, the one I'd saved for 3 years to buy. Veronica, not wanting to be left out of this family bonding moment at my expense, smiled sweetly, or as sweetly as someone with that much Botox could manage, which is to say not very. And your pride, dear, she cooed, her voice sugar-coated poison. I should have cried right then and there. Any normal person would have broken down, would have let the weight of this public humiliation crush them into the courthouse floor. The old Marcus, the one who'd believed in love and marriage and happily ever after, would have crumbled like a cookie in a trash compactor. But I didn't cry. Instead, I smiled. Not a big smile, nothing dramatic that would tip my hand, just a small, knowing smile that probably looked insane given the circumstances, but felt absolutely perfect. Because here's the thing they didn't know, the beautiful secret that was keeping me together while they tried to tear me apart. I had an envelope in my briefcase. A manila envelope, unremarkable on the outside but packed with enough explosive truth bombs on the inside to turn this entire courtroom proceeding into the greatest reality show episode never aired. They had no idea what was coming. None of them. Not Talia with her red lips and empty promises. Not Adrian with his smirk and borrowed confidence. Not even Veronica with her frozen face and calculating mind. They'd planned this whole performance, choreographed my downfall like a Broadway production, and they were so confident in their victory that they'd gotten sloppy. And me? I was about to turn their courtroom into a comedy show, with them as the punchline. 6 months earlier, I was living what I genuinely believed was a pretty decent life, the kind that didn't make headlines but didn't require therapy either, or so I thought in my blissfully ignorant state. I had a steady job running logistics for Brennan Construction, a mid-sized firm that specialized in commercial buildings and the occasional residential project when the money was right. The pay wasn't going to land me on any Forbes lists, but it covered the mortgage, kept the lights on, and left enough for the occasional weekend splurge at restaurants where the waiters didn't know your name because you came in too often. I had a decent home in a neighborhood that real estate agents called up and coming, which is code for not terrible, but not great either, and maybe don't walk around alone after dark. It was a 3-bedroom colonial with a yard that needed constant attention and a garage that had become a storage unit for things we swore we'd use someday, but never did. The kitchen had granite countertops that Talia had insisted on during renovations, the kind that cost more than my first car and apparently were essential for her Instagram aesthetic, even though she couldn't cook to save her life. And then there was my wife, Talia Marichan Richards, who pretended to love me with about the same enthusiasm and authenticity as she pretended to enjoy her twice-yearly diet kicks. You know the type? Every January and every June like clockwork, she'd announce she was getting serious about wellness and would buy enough salad ingredients to feed a rabbit army, only to abandon ship by week 2 when she remembered that kale tastes like punishment and quinoa has the texture of sand. I should have seen the pattern earlier, honestly. If she could lie to herself about loving vegetables, lying to me about loving me was probably just a minor upgrade in her deception skill set. Our mornings had this weird sitcom quality to them, except instead of laugh tracks, we had the sound of my soul slowly dying. I'd wake up at 6, stumble downstairs, and make breakfast while she'd eventually float down around 7:30. Already showered and made up like she was heading to a photo shoot instead of an office where she pushed papers around and apparently seduced her boss. But I didn't know that part yet. I'd plate up scrambled eggs, toast, maybe some bacon if I was feeling ambitious, and she'd look at it with this expression like I'd just served her roadkill on a paper plate. "Marcus, presentation matters," she'd say, pushing the eggs around with her fork like a food critic at a Michelin star restaurant. "You just pile it on the plate like we're at a prison cafeteria. Could you at least try to make it look appetizing?" "Lady, they're scrambled eggs, not the Mona Lisa," I'd think, but never say, because I was still operating under the delusion that happy marriages required you to swallow your sarcasm along with your pride. So I'd nod, apologize, and promise to watch more Food Network, which I never did because I had actual work to do and couldn't spend my afternoons learning how to make eggs look photogenic. The real morning ritual, though, the one I could set my watch by, was Veronica's daily phone call. This woman had a sixth sense for calling at the exact moment I sat down with my coffee, like she had cameras installed in our house, or maybe just that special mother-in-law radar that detects moments of peace and immediately destroys them. The conversation always, and I mean always, started the same way. "You still at that job, Marcus?" Not "good morning," or "how are you," or even, "is my daughter treating you like a human being today?" Just straight to questioning my employment status like I was some kind of professional job hopper who couldn't hold down a position at a lemonade stand. Never mind that I'd been at Brennan Construction for 4 years, had earned 2 promotions, and was basically running the entire logistics operation for the company's East Coast projects. None of that mattered to Veronica because in her world, if you weren't a surgeon, lawyer, or CEO, you were basically one step above homeless. Yes, Veronica, still at Brennan, I'd say, stirring my coffee with more force than necessary while Talia pretended not to hear the conversation even though she was sitting 3 feet away. She'd respond, and that contained more judgment than a Supreme Court ruling. "And they're treating you well?" No talks of restructuring. Restructuring was her fancy word for layoffs, because heaven forbid she used common terminology like normal people. If sarcasm burned calories, I'd have been shredded like a men's health cover model by month 2 of our marriage. I spent so much energy biting my tongue and swallowing snide comments that I should have had the jawline of a superhero. But instead, I just had high blood pressure and a growing collection of stress headaches that I treated with discount ibuprofen from Costco. The perfect mask, the one that made us look like a normal functioning couple to our neighbors and friends, started developing cracks around March. That's when Talia discovered what she called professional dedication and what I should have immediately recognized as covering for an affair. This was the same woman who'd complained about working a single minute past 5 o'clock, who'd once called me in a panic because a meeting ran 15 minutes over and she'd missed the early bird special at her nail salon. Suddenly, she was staying at the office until 8, 9, sometimes 10 at night. "Big project," she'd explain, breezing and smelling like expensive wine and someone else's cologne, though I didn't consciously register that detail yet because my brain was still in faithful husband mode and hadn't switched over to suspicious detective mode. "Adrian's really cracking down on deadlines. You know how he is." I didn't know how Adrian was, actually, because I'd only met the guy twice at company holiday parties where he'd given me the kind of handshake that was just a little too firm and the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He was one of those guys who wore expensive suits that fit too well and watches that cost more than reasonable people's cars. The kind of guy who said things like synergy and paradigm shift in normal conversation without a trace of irony. But Talia talked about him constantly. "Adrian thinks we should restructure the filing system. Adrian says the company needs to modernize. Adrian believes in work-life balance," which was rich coming from the guy who apparently believed work-life balance meant working late with other people's wives. I smelled trouble long before I saw it, and not just the cologne that wasn't mine lingering on her coat, though there was that too, some expensive designer scent that smelled like cedar and bad decisions. It was in the way she started checking her phone constantly, smiling at messages she wouldn't show me. It was in how she'd started going to the gym 4 times a week when she'd previously treated exercise like a war crime. It was in the new lingerie I found in her drawer, tags still attached, that definitely wasn't for my benefit since our intimate life had gone from occasionally enthusiastic to quarterly obligation somewhere around our 3rd anniversary. My buddy Jake from work, a guy who'd been through 2 divorces and considered himself a battlefield veteran of matrimonial warfare, pulled me aside one day at lunch. "Brother," he said, gesturing with a burrito that was falling apart in his hands. "I've seen that look before. That's the look of a man whose wife is either planning a surprise party or planning an exit strategy, and nobody plans surprise parties anymore. She's just busy with work," I'd said, because denial is a hell of a drug, and I was mainlining it. Jake had given me this look, this sad knowing look that said he'd been exactly where I was and knew how the story ended. "Sure, man. Work. Just keep your eyes open, yeah?" I should have listened to Jake. I should have trusted my gut, that queasy feeling I got every time Talia said she had to work late again. But instead, I did what a lot of people do when they sense their marriage is circling the drain. I worked harder at pretending everything was fine. I made nicer breakfasts. I cleaned the house more. I suggested date nights that she'd cancel last minute because of work emergencies. Looking back now, sitting in that courtroom 6 months later with all the truth laid bare, I realized that March was when my marriage died. I just didn't know it yet, because nobody tells you that betrayal doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. It sneaks in quietly, wearing expensive cologne and working late at the office, while you're at home making scrambled eggs that aren't pretty enough and answering phone calls from a mother-in-law who never thought you were good enough anyway. The happy lie was that I thought I had it all. The truth was that I never had any of it to begin with. It was a Tuesday, because of course betrayal picks the most boring day of the week to rear its ugly head and blow your life to smithereens. Not a Friday where you could at least drown your sorrows at happy hour. Not a Monday where everything already sucks anyway, so what's one more disaster? But a Tuesday, the middle child of weekdays that nobody thinks about and everyone forgets. The kind of day where your biggest concern should be whether to have leftover pizza or make a sandwich for lunch, not whether your entire marriage is a sham built on lies and designer cologne. I was cleaning the kitchen because that's what I did every Tuesday evening, like some kind of domestic robot programmed for mundane household tasks. Talia was supposedly at another one of her late meetings that had become so frequent I could have created a bingo card, and I was scrubbing the counter with the kind of aggressive determination usually reserved for crime scene cleanup. There was a stubborn coffee stain that had been there since Sunday, mocking me with its persistence, and I was taking out my vague frustrations on it with a sponge and enough elbow grease to polish a car. The kitchen was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and whatever mind-numbing playlist Spotify had decided I needed to hear, something with acoustic guitars and lyrics about love lasting forever, which in retrospect was the universe's idea of a cruel joke. I'd just started tackling the dishes in the sink, hands deep in soapy water that was slightly too hot, but felt kind of good in a punishing way, when I heard it, the buzz of Talia's phone sitting on the counter where she'd left it before jumping in the shower upstairs. Now, I'm not normally the kind of guy who checks his wife's phone. I believed in privacy, in trust, in all those things marriage counselors on YouTube say are the foundation of healthy relationships. But here's the thing about phones buzzing when your wife is upstairs and you're elbow deep in dish duty. Sometimes the screen lights up, and sometimes you glance over without really meaning to, and sometimes what you see makes your stomach drop faster than a stone in a lake. The message was right there on the lock screen. No need to even unlock the phone or do any of that spy movie stuff. Just sitting there in plain white text against her background photo of us at the beach from 2 years ago, back when I still believed her smile was genuine and not just good photography. Can't wait for tonight, baby. Wear the red dress. Adrian Redheart. I stood there, hands dripping soapy water onto the floor, staring at those words like they were written in some foreign language my brain refused to translate. Adrian. Her boss Adrian. The same Adrian who believed in work-life balance and professional development and apparently sleeping with his employees' wives. And baby? He was calling my wife baby. The audacity of this man was truly something that needed to be studied by scientists, maybe preserved in a museum under a placard that read, "Example of maximum human nerve." But it was the red dress part that really twisted the knife, that little detail that transformed this from abstract betrayal into something personal and cruel. The red dress. The one I'd saved up for and bought her for Christmas. The one that cost $300 at some boutique downtown where the salespeople looked at you like you might steal something if they didn't watch you closely enough. She'd opened it on Christmas morning, squealed with what I'd thought was genuine delight, kissed me, and said it was absolutely perfect. Perfect for date nights with me, I'd assumed like an idiot. Perfect for our anniversary dinner, maybe. Perfect for literally anything except wearing it for her boss, while I sat at home cleaning our kitchen like some kind of domestic servant who'd been demoted from husband to housekeeper without anyone bothering to tell him. My phone was right there next to hers, and for about 30 seconds I contemplated calling Jake, calling my brother, calling literally anyone who could confirm that yes, this was as bad as it seemed, and no, I wasn't having some kind of psychotic break where I hallucinated cheating evidence. But before I could reach for it, Talia's phone buzzed again. This time, I definitely looked on purpose, leaning over like I was investigating a crime scene, which I guess I was in a way, the crime scene of my murdered marriage. Veronica says the plan's working perfectly. He won't suspect a thing. And there it was, The second punch that lands right after the first one when you're already reeling. Not only was my wife cheating on me with her boss, but my mother-in-law, the woman who'd given a tearful speech at our wedding about how happy she was to welcome me into the family, which I now realized was a performance worthy of an Oscar, was actively involved in whatever scheme they were running. The plan. They had a plan. A plan that involved me being too stupid or too trusting or too busy scrubbing coffee stains to notice that my entire life was being systematically dismantled by the people who were supposed to care about me. I stood there in my kitchen, water still dripping from my hands onto the hardwood floor that I'd spent a weekend refinishing last summer, and felt all these emotions crash over me like waves. Anger, sure, that was the obvious one. The hot, burning rage that made me want to march upstairs and confront Talia right there in the shower, watch her try to explain away these messages with whatever lies she'd surely have prepared. Hurt, definitely. That deep, aching feeling that starts in your chest and spreads outward until your whole body feels heavy. Betrayal, humiliation, shock, the whole buffet of negative emotions you get to sample when you discover your marriage is a fraud. But underneath all of that, competing with it and eventually winning out, was something else entirely. It was clarity. Sudden, sharp, crystal clear clarity that cut through all the confusion and doubt I'd been feeling for months. All those late nights at work, all the new clothes, all the times she'd pulled away when I tried to kiss her or touch her or do any of the things married couples are supposed to do. It all made sense now. I wasn't going crazy. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being played, and apparently not very well since they'd gotten sloppy enough to leave evidence lying around on unlocked phones in easily accessible kitchens. The old Marcus, the one who'd existed up until about 3 minutes ago, would have exploded right then. Would have screamed and thrown things, and probably done something stupid that would have given them ammunition to use against me later. Would have stormed upstairs and made a scene that the neighbors would have heard through the walls, giving them something to gossip about at the next HOA meeting. But I didn't explode. I didn't throw her phone against the wall or chuck it in the sink with the dishes or do any of the dramatic things my body was urging me to do. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I smiled. Not a big smile, not the kind that would look insane if anyone saw it, just a small, private smile that felt like the first honest expression I'd worn in months. Because here's the thing about betrayal that nobody tells you until you experience it firsthand. It's like bad sushi from that sketchy place downtown that you knew you shouldn't eat at, but did anyway, because you were hungry and stupid and thought you'd be fine. Once you swallow it, once it's in your system, you can't just spit it out or wish it away. You've got to let it run its course, let your body process it, deal with all the unpleasant symptoms that come with it, and then eventually flush it out of your system entirely. I picked up a dish towel and dried my hands carefully, methodically, like I was performing surgery instead of just wiping off water. I looked at Talia's phone one more time, memorizing those messages, burning them into my brain so I'd never forget this moment, this turning point where everything changed. Then I went back to washing dishes, back to scrubbing that stubborn coffee stain, back to being the husband who supposedly won't suspect a thing. Because if they wanted to play games, if they wanted to run plans and schemes and whatever else they had cooking, then fine. I could play too. And unlike them, I'd actually be good at it. Enter Leo Cruz, my college roommate turned private investigator, and probably the only person in my life who hadn't stabbed me in the back yet, though statistically speaking, I was probably due for another betrayal any day now. Leo and I had met during freshman year at State, bonded over our mutual hatred of our pretentious philosophy professor who insisted we call him Dr. Enlightenment. Yes, really. And had stayed friends through all the years that followed, even when life took us in completely different directions. While I'd gone the corporate route, climbing the ladder at construction firms and attending boring meetings about quarterly projections, Leo had taken his criminal justice degree and transformed himself into something between a private investigator and a tech wizard, specializing in cases that required more gadgets than common sense. The man had more surveillance equipment than Batman's utility belt and worse coffee than the DMV, which is really saying something, because DMV coffee tastes like it was brewed using water from the same place they develop photos of terrible driver's license pictures. His office was located above a dry cleaner in a part of town that real estate agents called emerging and everyone else called sketchy but not actively dangerous, wedged between a pawn shop that had definitely seen some criminal activity and a diner that served breakfast all day to people who looked like they'd seen some stuff and weren't interested in discussing it. I showed up at Leo's office on a Wednesday afternoon, having taken a half day from work using the excuse of a dental appointment, which my boss had accepted without question because apparently I looked terrible enough that he believed I needed medical intervention. The stairs leading up to Leo's place smelled like a combination of chemical solvent from the dry cleaner and something that might have been curry from the Indian restaurant 2 doors down, creating an olfactory experience that could only be described as aggressive. Leo opened the door before I even knocked, which should have freaked me out, except I knew he had cameras covering every angle of the building because he was paranoid in that way that private investigators get when they've seen too much of humanity's garbage. He took one look at my face and whistled low, the kind of whistle you make when you see a car accident on the highway that's definitely going to make the evening news. "Damn, Marcus, you look like someone ran over your dog, backed up, and then ran over it again just to make sure," he said, stepping aside to let me into his office, which was exactly as chaotic as I'd expected. Papers covered every surface, multiple computer monitors displayed various feeds and windows I couldn't begin to understand, and there was a half-eaten sandwich on his desk that looked like it had been there since the previous administration. "Worse," I said, collapsing into the chair across from his desk, which had seen better days and was currently held together by what appeared to be duct tape and hope. "Someone's running over my life, and they've invited my mother-in-law to drive." I told him everything. The messages on Talia's phone, the red dress that was apparently moonlighting as a fair attire, Veronica's involvement in whatever plan they were executing, all the late nights and suspicious behavior I'd been too stupid or too trusting to question before. Leo listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him because the man normally had opinions about everything from politics to pizza toppings. But he just sat there nodding and occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad that already looked full of other people's disasters. When I finished my sad story, Leo leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously like it was considering collapse, and whistled again. "So your wife's cheating with her boss and her mom's the campaign manager? Damn, Marcus, that's not just betrayal, that's a family project. That's like if Betrayal had a group chat and everyone was actively participating. Do they have matching t-shirts? A team slogan?" "Not helping, Leo," I said, though his sarcasm was actually weirdly comforting because at least someone was treating this situation with the absurdity it deserved instead of the tragic drama everyone else would probably go for. "Actually, I am helping," he said, spinning around to one of his computers and cracking his knuckles like a concert pianist about to perform. "Because unlike your wife, I'm actually good at my job, and unlike your mother-in-law, I'm going to use my powers for good instead of evil. Give me 3 days. Just 3 days, and I'll get you everything you need to know exactly what these people are up to." 3 days felt like 3 years, but I nodded and left Leo to his computers and surveillance equipment and terrible coffee. I went home that night and pretended everything was normal, smiled at Talia when she came home at 9:30 claiming another late meeting, and even complimented her hair, which she'd gotten cut that afternoon at a salon that charged more than my monthly car payment. Playing dumb was harder than I'd expected, like being in a play where everyone else had the script except you, but you had to pretend you knew all your lines anyway. Those 3 days were torture. I jumped every time my phone buzzed, thinking it might be Leo with updates. I analyzed every word Talia said, looking for clues or slips or anything that would confirm what I already knew. I avoided calling Veronica back when she left her daily voicemail asking about my job status, because I was pretty sure if I heard her voice I'd say something that would blow my cover as the oblivious husband. Finally, on Saturday morning, Leo called. "Get to my office. Now. And Marcus? Bring your stomach, because you're going to need it." I made it to his office in record time, probably breaking several traffic laws that I'd worry about later if I survived whatever Leo was about to show me. He had that look on his face, the one he got when he'd uncovered something big, a mixture of professional pride and human disgust that told me whatever he'd found was going to hurt. He handed me a manila folder that felt heavier than it should have, like the papers inside were made of lead instead of standard office supply store stock. "I got photos, records, timestamps, the whole package," Leo said, and his voice had lost all its usual humor. "I'm sorry, man. I really am." I opened the folder, And there it was, my marriage's autopsy report, complete with photographic evidence. Talia and Adrian at hotels, and not the cheap ones either, but places with names like the Grandview and the Sterling, the kind of places that had doorman and thread counts higher than my credit score. There were photos of them holding hands at restaurants I couldn't afford, kissing in the parking lot of my gym, my GYM, the place I went to work out and try to stay healthy, and they'd contaminated it with their affair like some kind of betrayal biohazard. But the real kicker, the thing that made my hands shake as I flipped through the evidence, was a recording Leo had managed to plant under Veronica's table at some fancy restaurant downtown. He'd followed her there, watched her meet with Talia and Adrian for what was apparently a strategy session, and had used some kind of device that looked like a pen but was actually a recorder because Leo was basically James Bond if James Bond had worse fashion sense and an office above a dry cleaner. I plugged in the earbuds Leo handed me and pressed play, and Veronica's voice came through crystal clear, like Satan had decided to start an audiobook career. Once the divorce hits, Talia gets the house, Adrian runs the business connections, and Marcus gets to keep his tears. Maybe his car if we're feeling generous, but honestly, he doesn't deserve it. They were laughing, all three of them, laughing like this was the funniest thing they'd ever heard, like my financial funeral was prime entertainment. Talia's voice chimed in, "Mom, you're terrible, but also brilliant. He has no idea any of this is coming." "Of course he doesn't," Veronica responded, and I could hear the smugness dripping from every word. Men like Marcus never do. They're too busy being loyal and dependable to notice when they're being used. It's almost sad. Almost. I pulled out the earbuds and sat there in Leo's crappy office, surrounded by the evidence of my wife's betrayal, my mother-in-law's manipulation, and my own spectacular blindness. Leo watched me carefully, probably worried I was going to have a breakdown or punch a wall or do something that would require him to use his investigator skills for damage control. But I didn't break down. Instead, I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest, something that felt like clarity mixed with determination and seasoned with righteous anger. They were planning my financial funeral? Fine. I'd just have to make sure I was the one who survived to attend it. "Leo," I said, looking up at my friend who'd just handed me the ammunition I needed, "how do you feel about helping me plan a counterattack?" He grinned, that wild grin that reminded me why we'd stayed friends all these years. "Brother, I thought you'd never ask." Leo and I decided to dig deeper, which in retrospect sounds like the opening line to either a really good detective story or a really bad horror movie. And spoiler alert, it ended up being both. We were sitting in his office, surrounded by all the evidence he'd already collected, and I was having what could only be described as a moment of clarity mixed with temporary insanity. The kind of moment where you make decisions that future you will either thank you for or curse you out for, depending on how things shake out. "I have a spare key to Veronica's house," I said, the words coming out before my brain could fully process what I was suggesting. "She gave it to us years ago for emergencies, back when she was pretending to trust me with basic household responsibilities." Leo looked at me like I'd just suggested we rob a bank using water guns and a strongly worded letter. "Marcus, buddy, pal, my legally not responsible for your decisions friend. Are you seriously proposing we break into your mother-in-law's house?" "It's not breaking in if I have a key," I countered, using the kind of logic that sounds solid at 2 in the morning, but probably wouldn't hold up in actual court. "That's just entering. Legally. With permission that was granted under false pretenses, but still technically permission." "That is absolutely not how the law works," Leo said. But he was already pulling out his bag of tricks, the one he used for jobs that required what he called field work, and what normal people called probably illegal, but we're not going to think too hard about it. "But you know what? I'm in. This woman orchestrated a conspiracy against you involving her own daughter and some corporate sleazebag. If we're going down swinging." That's how I found myself, on a Tuesday afternoon, again with the Tuesdays. Apparently that was just my day for life-changing terrible decisions. Parked outside Veronica's house in the suburbs, the kind of neighborhood where everyone's lawn looked like it was maintained by professional gardeners, and the HOA had 17 rules about acceptable mailbox colors. Veronica lived in a McMansion that screamed, "I have money and I want everyone to know it," complete with columns that served no structural purpose and a fountain in the front yard that definitely violated some kind of water conservation ordinance. I'd called ahead, Naturally, because I wasn't completely stupid despite all evidence to the contrary. Used the excuse that I needed to check on her smoke detectors because there'd been a recall. A complete lie, but delivered with enough concerned son-in-law energy that she'd bought it immediately and told me she'd be out all afternoon at her bridge club, which was apparently where rich suburban moms went to drink wine and judge other people's life choices. You ready for this? Leo asked, checking his watch like we were about to storm a beach instead of entering a house I technically had permission to access. He'd insisted on coming with me, bringing along some kind of camera that looked like it belonged in a spy movie and a device he claimed could detect hidden safes, though I suspected he just liked having an excuse to use his gadgets. Ready as I'll ever be, I said, which wasn't very ready at all. But we were already here, and backing out now would just mean I'd spend an hour in traffic for nothing. Using the key felt wrong, like crossing some invisible line between suspicious son-in-law and actual criminal, but I turned it in the lock anyway, and the door swung open to reveal Veronica's interior design nightmare. Everything was white. White carpets, white furniture, white walls. The kind of white that screamed, I don't have children or any concept of how real people live. There were vases that probably cost more than my monthly salary positioned on tables that looked too delicate to actually use, and paintings on the walls that were either very expensive modern art or something a toddler could have made with finger paints. Honestly, hard to tell the difference. Where do we start? Leo whispered, even though we were alone in the house and whispering was completely unnecessary, but I guess breaking and entering, legally entering, brings out the dramatic in everyone. Home office, I said, remembering the room Veronica had shown off during a Christmas party, the one she'd called her command center, which should have been my first clue that she was some kind of supervillain. Second door on the right upstairs. We climbed the staircase, me feeling like I was walking to my own execution and Leo looking like he was having the time of his life, and found the office exactly where I remembered it. Veronica's desk was one of those massive wooden things that looked like it had been stolen from a CEO's corner office, complete with a leather chair that probably cost more than my car and enough drawer space to hide bodies, which given what we were about to find wasn't that far off from the truth. Leo went to work on the desk while I tackled the filing cabinet in the corner, and that's when things went from, this is probably a bad idea, to holy hell, what fresh nightmare is this? The filing cabinet wasn't locked, which should have been my first warning that Veronica was so confident in her schemes that she didn't even bother hiding them properly, the kind of arrogance that comes from never being caught or questioned or held accountable for anything in your entire privileged life. The first folder I pulled out was labeled Marcus, evidence, in Veronica's neat handwriting. And I'm not going to lie, seeing my name on a folder in my mother-in-law's filing cabinet felt like finding out you're the subject of a true crime documentary, except you're still alive to see it. I opened it with hands that shook slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the anticipation of just how bad this was going to be. What I found would make a therapist quit their job and move to a monastery where they didn't have to deal with human behavior anymore. Photos of me. And I mean lots of photos, enough to fill an album, except this wasn't the heartwarming family kind. This was the collecting evidence for a lawsuit kind. There was a photo of me yawning at a family dinner, captioned in Veronica's handwriting. Lack of ambition, constantly tired, no drive. Lady, I was yawning because your stories about your bridge club drama put me to sleep, not because I lacked ambition. Another photo showed me fixing the leaky sink at our house. Something I'd done on a Saturday morning because we couldn't afford a plumber and I'd watched enough YouTube videos to figure it out. Veronica's caption, desperate for attention, needs to feel useful, possible inferiority complex. I was fixing a damn sink, not performing surgery on national television. The mental gymnastics required to turn basic home maintenance into a psychological disorder deserved some kind of award for creative character assassination. Then there was my personal favorite. A photo of me eating leftovers straight from the Tupperware container while standing at the counter, something literally every human being with a functional digestive system has done at least once in their lives. Her caption, financially unstable behavior, cannot afford proper meals, lacks basic social graces. Lady, I wasn't financially unstable. I was married to your daughter who'd just spent $200 at Target on decorative pillows we didn't need. And I was trying to save money by eating the perfectly good Chinese food from 2 nights ago, instead of ordering new food like some kind of wasteful monster. "Marcus," Leo called from the desk, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You need to see this. Now." I walked over to find him holding a stack of letters, official-looking documents on law firm letterhead that made my stomach drop to somewhere around my knees. They were letters to lawyers, multiple lawyers from the looks of it, all describing me in terms that would make a villain from a soap opera seem sympathetic by comparison. Erratic behavior, emotionally unstable, lazy and unmotivated, financially irresponsible, possibly dangerous. Possibly dangerous? I'd never raised my voice to Talia, never broken anything in anger, never done anything remotely threatening. But here was Veronica painting me as some kind of ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The letters detailed a plan to document my declining mental state and increasingly erratic behavior to support what they were calling an urgent divorce filing based on safety concerns. But wait, there was more, because apparently this horror show came with bonus features. Leo found financial statements where my name had been conveniently omitted from joint accounts, making it look like Talia had funded everything in our marriage while I contributed nothing. Found deed transfers that had been prepared but not yet filed, ready to strip my name from our house the moment the divorce papers were signed. Found credit card statements showing purchases I'd never made, probably forgeries designed to make me look like a spending-addicted mess. And then, buried at the bottom of another folder labeled Adrian, background, Leo found something that made both of us stop and stare. A background check on Adrian Prescott, the golden boy, the supposed upgrade from me, the man who was going to bring class to the family, according to Veronica's own words that Leo had recorded. Adrian had fraud charges. Multiple fraud charges from 8 years ago involving a real estate scheme that had collapsed and left investors holding worthless paper. The charges had been settled out of court with enough money changing hands to make them disappear from casual searches, but they were there, documented in black and white, showing that the man Veronica wanted to replace me with was actually a legitimate criminal who just had enough money to make his crimes go away. And Veronica knew. The dates on the background check showed she'd run it months ago, right around the time Talia's affair had started, which meant she'd known exactly what Adrian was, and had decided he was still better than me because apparently having actual fraud charges was more acceptable than eating leftovers from Tupperware. "This isn't just betrayal," I said, looking at Leo with the kind of clarity that only comes when you've seen the absolute worst of people you thought you knew. "This is corporate sabotage. This is a conspiracy. This is enough evidence to bury them," Leo finished, already photographing every document with his fancy spy camera. "Marcus, my friend, what we have here is enough ammunition to turn that courtroom into their worst nightmare." I stood there in Veronica's pristine white office, surrounded by evidence of her hatred and manipulation, and felt something shift inside me. The old Marcus, the one who'd believed in family and loyalty and giving people the benefit of the doubt, died somewhere between the yawning photo and the fraud charges. The new Marcus, the one holding a folder full of his own character assassination, was ready for war. We spent another hour photographing everything, making sure we had copies of every document, every photo, every piece of evidence that Veronica had so carefully compiled in her mission to destroy me. When we finally left, locking the door behind us and driving away from that white McMansion of horrors, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd just downloaded all the proof I needed that I wasn't crazy, wasn't the problem, wasn't any of the things they tried to make me believe I was. "You know what the best part is?" Leo said as we drove back toward the city. "She did all our work for us. She documented everything so thoroughly that we don't even need to investigate further. She gift-wrapped the evidence of her own conspiracy." He was right. Veronica's arrogance, her absolute certainty that she'd never be caught or questioned, had led her to create a paper trail that would make prosecutors weep with joy. She'd been so busy building a case against me that she'd accidentally built a case against herself. And now? Now I had everything I needed to make sure that when we got to that courtroom, I wouldn't be the one walking away with nothing but my tears. I could have screamed. I could have marched straight back home that Tuesday evening, thrown every single piece of evidence in Talia's face, and watched her try to explain away photos of her tongue down Adrian's throat like she was giving him CPR in a parking lot. I could have called Veronica and told her exactly what I thought of her little filing cabinet of horrors and her character assassination project, that had clearly taken more effort than she'd ever put into actually being a decent human being. I could have done a lot of things that would have felt good in the moment and terrible in the long run, like eating an entire pizza at midnight or texting your ex after 3 beers, satisfying temporarily, but ultimately a disaster. Instead, I did something that required more self-control than I'd ever exercised in my entire life. I played dumb. Not just regular dumb, but Oscar-worthy, method acting, Daniel Day-Lewis level dumb. I became the oblivious husband they thought I was, the clueless fool who couldn't see what was happening right under his nose even though it was more obvious than a neon sign in a blackout. I smiled through dinners where Talia would come home late smelling like wine and Adrian's expensive cologne that probably cost more per ounce than my car insurance. I'd ask about her day with genuine interest plastered on my face like a mask I couldn't take off, and she'd spin elaborate stories about meetings and deadlines and projects that needed her undivided attention, and I'd nod along like I was listening to fascinating information instead of transparent lies that a toddler could see through. "How was work, honey?" I'd ask, setting down plates of whatever dinner I'd managed to cook, because apparently I'd become both the suspicious husband and the domestic servant in this twisted situation. "Exhausting," she'd sigh, pushing food around her plate in that way she did when she was lying, though I hadn't recognized it as a tell until now. Adrian had us in back-to-back meetings all afternoon. The new client portfolio is absolutely brutal. "Sounds rough," I'd say, taking a bite of the chicken that I'd actually seasoned properly this time, with presentation and everything. Not that she noticed or cared. "You should take it easy this weekend, maybe relax." She'd smile at me then, this condescending smile that I now recognized as the expression of someone who thought they were getting away with murder, and say something like, "You're so sweet, Marcus." So, uncomplicated. Uncomplicated. That was her code word for stupid, I realized. Every time she called me sweet or simple or uncomplicated, she was really saying, "Thank God you're too dumb to figure out what I'm doing." The thing about hindsight is that it makes you want to go back in time and slap yourself for missing obvious clues. But time travel hasn't been invented yet, so I just had to sit there with my newfound knowledge and my carefully maintained poker face. The worst part was dealing with Veronica's calls, which continued with the regularity of a Swiss watch and the warmth of a restraining order. She'd call every morning, always right when I was trying to enjoy my coffee in peace, and launch into her usual interrogation about my job status and life choices. "Marcus, dear," she'd say, and the dear sounded like she was saying disappointment, but with more syllables. "Still at Brennan? No changes? No developments?" She was fishing, I realized. Fishing to see if I'd noticed anything, if I suspected anything, if I was about to blow up their carefully orchestrated plan. And every time, I'd give her exactly what she wanted to hear. "Nope, same old, Veronica," I'd say, injecting just enough boring contentment into my voice to make her believe I was the most oblivious man on planet Earth. "Everything's great. Talia's doing amazing at work. I'm keeping busy. Life is good." I could practically hear her smiling through the phone, that self-satisfied smile of someone who thought their plan was working perfectly. "That's wonderful, Marcus. Just wonderful." Meanwhile, Leo was working overtime collecting evidence like he was preparing for the trial of the century, which in a way, I guess he was. He'd set up surveillance on Adrian's apartment, a penthouse in the expensive part of downtown that probably had a doorman and a gym and all those amenities that separated living from living well. The photos he collected were damning enough to sink a battleship. Talia showing up at Adrian's place at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday, when she'd told me she was at her book club, leaving at 1 a.m. looking significantly more disheveled than any book discussion should warrant. "Your wife's book club meets at Adrian's bedroom, apparently," Leo had said, showing me the photos in his office while I tried not to put my fist through his wall. "And the only thing they're reading is each other's text messages, based on how much time they spend on their phones." He'd also tracked their bank transfers, found a secret account Talia had opened 3 months ago, and had been funneling money into, probably preparing for her post-divorce life of luxury with Adrian. Found emails between Talia and her divorce lawyer, a shark named Patricia Hendricks who specialized in high-conflict separations, which was lawyer code for, "I'll take everything you have and make you thank me for it." The emails were particularly enlightening, painting a picture of me that would make anyone think I was one bad day away from a complete breakdown. unstable behavior patterns, emotional volatility, possible substance issues. I didn't have substance issues unless you counted an unhealthy dependence on coffee and sarcasm, but apparently Veronica's documentation project had included making up problems that didn't exist. They're building a narrative, Leo explained, showing me printouts of the correspondence. Classic divorce strategy. Make you look like a mess, make her look like a victim, take everything in the settlement. But here's the thing they didn't count on. We have evidence that their evidence is fabricated. That's like evidence inception. While they were busy painting me as an unstable, unemployed man-child who couldn't function without supervision, I was busy being exactly what I'd always been. A guy who worked 60-hour weeks managing complex logistics for a construction company, paid bills on time, maintained the house, and made breakfast that apparently needed better presentation, but was still perfectly edible. The disconnect between their fantasy Marcus and actual Marcus was so wide you could drive a convoy of trucks through it. I started keeping my own documentation, just in case. Photos of my timesheets showing the hours I actually worked, not the imaginary part-time schedule they were claiming. Bank statements proving I contributed equally to household expenses, contrary to their narrative that I was some kind of financial parasite. Even character references from my boss and co-workers, people who could attest that I wasn't the hot mess Veronica's file suggested. You're building a counter case, Leo observed during one of our strategy sessions in his office, which had become our unofficial war room. This is good. This is smart. You're thinking like someone who's about to absolutely wreck these people in court. I'm thinking like someone who's tired of being treated like an idiot. I corrected, sorting through another stack of evidence. They want to play games? Fine. But I'm done being the pawn. Time to be the player. The hardest part wasn't collecting evidence or maintaining my cover. It was watching Talia come home every night and pretend she still loved me, or at least pretend she didn't actively hate me. She'd kiss me on the cheek, this perfunctory gesture that had as much feeling as kissing a doorknob, and ask about my day like she cared, and I'd tell her about spreadsheets and delivery schedules and all the boring details of my actual life, while she mentally calculated how much of it she could take in the divorce. My buddy Jake from work noticed something was different, pulled me aside one day during lunch, and asked if everything was okay at home. "You've got that look, man," he said, gesturing vaguely at my face. "That's the look of someone who knows something but can't say it yet. I've worn that look. It sucks. Everything's fine." I lied, because I couldn't risk word getting back to Talia through the workplace gossip chain. Just stressed about the Morrison project. Jake didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. But he nodded anyway and changed the subject to football, which I appreciated because pretending to care about sports was easier than pretending my marriage wasn't a complete dumpster fire. The weeks crawled by with agonizing slowness, each day feeling like a month as I smiled and nodded and played the part of the husband who won't suspect a thing. I complimented Veronica's unsolicited advice about my career, thanked Talia for her patience with my various imaginary shortcomings, and generally acted like the perfect victim they needed me to be. But here's what they didn't understand, what their arrogance prevented them from seeing. The calm before the storm isn't weakness. It's preparation. It's strategy. It's the moment when you load all your ammunition and check your aim and wait for exactly the right time to fire. And my time was coming. The divorce papers were apparently being prepared, the trap was being set, and they thought they were the hunters. They had no idea they were about to become the prey, that every smile I gave them was really me counting down to the moment when their whole world would collapse. Leo called it the clapback. I called it justice. Either way, it was going to be spectacular. The divorce papers arrived on a sunny Thursday, which felt like the universe's idea of a sick joke, the kind of cosmic irony that makes you wonder if God has a twisted sense of humor or just really enjoys watching people suffer in high definition. There's something particularly offensive about receiving documents that essentially accuse you of being worthless as a human being while the sun is shining and birds are chirping and everything outside looks like a scene from a feel-good movie. It was 72 degrees, not a cloud in the sky, the kind of perfect spring day where people go jogging or have picnics or do literally anything except get served with divorce papers that read like a character assassination written by someone who failed creative writing but passed advanced lying. I was standing in the kitchen, always the kitchen. Apparently that was my designated spot for life-changing disasters. making a sandwich for lunch because I'd actually taken a personal day from work, told my boss I needed to handle some family matters, which wasn't technically a lie even if he assumed I meant something normal like a sick relative instead of preparing for legal warfare against my wife and her criminal boyfriend. The doorbell rang just as I was debating whether to add tomatoes, and I opened it to find a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, which made two of us. "Marcus Reed?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and was just following protocol. "That's me," I said, accepting the manila envelope that felt like it weighed about 1,000 pounds despite being just paper and ink and lies. "You've been served. Have a nice day," he said, which had to be the most absurd thing anyone had ever said while handing someone divorce papers. "Have a nice day? Really? That's like a doctor saying congratulations after diagnosing you with food poisoning. Nothing says have a nice day like legal documents that essentially call you a failure as a husband, a provider, and a human being capable of basic functioning. I closed the door, walked back to the kitchen, and opened the envelope with the same enthusiasm most people reserve for opening bills or jury duty summons. The papers were thick, professionally printed on expensive legal letterhead that probably cost more than my lunch, and they painted a picture of our marriage that would have been hilarious if it wasn't so infuriating. According to Patricia Hendricks, Esquire, attorney extraordinaire and professional homewrecker, I was an emotionally unstable individual with erratic behavior patterns and questionable employment stability. I was financially irresponsible and unable to contribute meaningfully to the household. I had demonstrated concerning patterns of behavior including isolation, mood swings, and potential substance dependency. Isolation. I'd been isolated because my wife was screwing her boss and avoiding me. Mood swings? Yeah, I got moody when I discovered my marriage was a fraud. Potential substance dependency? Lady, I drank coffee and occasionally had a beer while watching sports I didn't care about. If that's substance dependency, then half of America needs rehab. The really creative part was how they twisted every normal thing I did into evidence of my inadequacy. Worked long hours, absent from the home, and emotionally unavailable. Tried to save money, financially controlling and restrictive. Fixed things around the house. Obsessive need for control and validation. They'd taken the entire scope of normal human behavior and run it through some kind of reverse psychology machine that turned everything into a red flag. My phone rang before I'd even finished reading through all the character assassination, and naturally, it was Talia, because apparently receiving divorce papers wasn't traumatic enough without a follow-up call from the person trying to destroy your life. I almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail so I could throw my phone into the wall and pretend this wasn't happening. But then I remembered, I was playing a part. The oblivious, soon-to-be defeated husband who didn't see any of this coming. "Hello," I answered, injecting just enough confusion into my voice to sound authentic. "Marcus," Talia said, and her voice had that sugary quality she used when she wanted something or was about to deliver bad news disguised as kindness, like a poison cake with really good frosting. "I'm sure you've received the papers by now. I just wanted to call and make sure you're okay. I know this must be difficult for you." "Difficult for me? Lady, you're divorcing me while sleeping with your boss and letting your mother document my every move like I'm a criminal on trial. And you want to check if I'm okay? That's like stabbing someone and then asking if they need a Band-Aid." "I'm processing," I said, which wasn't a lie. I was processing a lot of things, mainly how I'd managed to marry someone with the empathy of a parking meter and the moral compass of a broken GPS. "I want you to know this isn't personal," she continued. And I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing, because how is divorce not personal? "You're a good person, Marcus, you really are. You're just not the right person for me. You'll find someone more suited to your level, someone more average." Average. There it was, the word that summarized how she really saw me, how she'd probably always seen me. Not someone who worked hard, not someone who'd supported her career and dealt with her nightmare mother, and tried to make our marriage work despite all the red flags that I'd ignored because I was stupid enough to believe in love. Just average. Mediocre. Good enough for someone else, maybe, but not good enough for her now that she'd upgraded to a boss with a fraud record and an expensive watch. Something snapped in that moment. Some internal wire that had been holding back my sarcasm and anger and sheer disbelief at the audacity of this woman. "Wow," I said, and my voice came out calmer than I felt, which was an achievement considering I wanted to scream. You're really leveling up here, Talia. From wife to headline on a courtroom transcript. That's quite the career move. There was a pause, a moment of silence where I could practically hear her trying to figure out if I was being sincere or sarcastic, if I understood what she'd just said, or if I was too average to catch the insult. What's that supposed to mean? She finally asked. Nothing, I said, smiling to myself even though she couldn't see it. Just wishing you all the best with your future endeavors. I'm sure Adrian will bring a lot to your relationship. A criminal record, for instance. That's something new. Another pause, longer this time, and I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't, I said. Have a great day, Talia. Really, enjoy it while it lasts. I hung up before she could respond, before she could spin more lies or try to manipulate me with that fake concern she wore like a costume. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline of finally saying something that wasn't part of my act, of letting a tiny crack show in my oblivious husband facade. She didn't get it, of course. The comment about Adrian's record went right over her head, probably because Veronica had convinced her it didn't matter or didn't exist or was somehow my fault. That was fine. I wasn't aiming for immediate laughs or recognition or any kind of dramatic revelation. This wasn't a movie where the hero drops hints and the villain suddenly realizes they're doomed. This was real life, and in real life, the best revenge is served so cold it gives people frostbite. I picked up my phone again and called Leo, who answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting for this exact moment, which knowing Leo, he probably had been. They served you, he asked without preamble. Yep, I said, looking at the papers spread across my kitchen counter like a crime scene. Full character assassination, creative writing worthy of a fiction award, the works. They're going for everything. Good, Leo said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. That means they're confident. Overconfident. That's when people make mistakes. It's showtime, I said, feeling something settle in my chest, something that felt like determination mixed with righteous anger and seasoned with just enough pettiness to make things interesting. How fast can you compile everything we've got into a format that'll make a judge actually pay attention? Already done, Leo said, because of course he was ahead of me. I've got photos, recordings, financial records, Veronica's entire filing cabinet of crazy, Adrian's background checks showing his fraud charges, emails between Talia and her lawyer, bank transfers to secret accounts, and a timeline that shows they've been planning this for at least 6 months. It's beautiful, Marcus. Like a symphony of evidence. Can you have it ready for the hearing? Brother, I'll have it ready and gift-wrapped with a bow. I'll bring popcorn too, because this is going to be one hell of a show. I looked at the divorce papers again, at all the lies and manipulations and twisted versions of reality that they thought would bury me. They thought I was average, thought I was too stupid or too trusting or too broken to fight back. They thought they could take my house, my car, my pride, my entire life, and I'd just accept it because that's what average people do when faced with superior forces. But here's what they didn't understand, what their arrogance and their careful planning and their 6 months of scheming had blinded them to. Average people can be dangerous when you push them too far. Average people can collect evidence and build cases and wait for exactly the right moment to strike. Average people can smile through betrayal and document every lie and prepare for war while their enemies celebrate victories that haven't happened yet. The sun was still shining outside, birds still chirping, the perfect Thursday continuing like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The papers were served, the trap was set, and they thought they were closing in for the kill. They had no idea the prey had teeth. I visited Veronica one last time exactly 3 days after receiving the divorce papers, which gave me just enough time to practice my broken man routine in the mirror like some kind of depressing theater production where the only audience member was my reflection and we both knew the performance was terrible but necessary. Leo had coached me on what to say, how to act, what emotional buttons to push to get Veronica talking, because apparently being a private investigator also meant being an amateur psychologist who understood how narcissists couldn't resist an audience, especially when that audience was someone they'd successfully destroyed. You need to go in defeated, Leo had said during our strategy session the night before, demonstrating what defeated looked like by slumping in his chair, and making his face do this sad, droopy thing that honestly made him look like a depressed basset hound. She needs to think she's won completely, that you're there to basically wave the white flag and maybe beg for scraps. Narcissists can't resist a victory lap. She'll want to gloat, and when she gloats, she'll tell you everything. And I'll be recording the whole thing, I'd confirmed, holding up the pen that wasn't actually a pen, but was instead a recording device that Leo had acquired through methods I decided not to ask about, because plausible deniability seemed like a good legal strategy. Exactly. Just remember, you're not Marcus the logistics manager who has his life together. You're Marcus the broken failure who's finally realized how pathetic he is. Channel every sad movie you've ever seen, every country song about heartbreak, every insurance commercial that makes people cry for no reason. So there I was, Thursday evening, pulling up to Veronica's McMansion of horrors in my car that apparently I didn't deserve to keep according to their divorce papers, wearing my most defeated expression and carrying emotional baggage that was partly real and partly performed. I'd called ahead, naturally, told her I needed to talk, let my voice crack just enough to sound desperate without overselling it, because even Veronica might be suspicious if I showed up acting like a character from a soap opera. She'd agreed immediately, which should have been my first clue that she was absolutely thrilled at the opportunity to twist the knife a little deeper, and told me to come by at 7 because that's when she'd be done with her evening yoga class, which was apparently a thing rich people did to feel virtuous about their terrible life choices. The door opened before I even knocked, and there stood Veronica in workout clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her face frozen in that Botox smile that somehow managed to look both welcoming and threatening simultaneously, like a shark that had learned to mimic human expressions but hadn't quite mastered the warmth part. "Marcus," she said, and her voice dripped with so much fake concern it could have flooded her foyer. "Come in, dear. You look terrible." "Thanks, Veronica," I said, shuffling inside like a man who'd given up on basic posture and dignity, which wasn't entirely acting because the past few days had been exhausting, and pretending to be okay while your life imploded was harder than any physical labor I'd ever done. "I feel terrible." She led me to her living room, the one with the white furniture that still looked like it had never been sat on by actual humans, and gestured for me to sit on the couch, while she perched on an armchair like a queen preparing to address a peasant. I sank into the cushions with the defeated energy of someone who'd already lost everything, made sure the recording pin in my shirt pocket was positioned correctly, and prepared to give the performance of my lifetime. "I suppose you received the papers," Veronica said, not even bothering to ease into the conversation because subtlety had never been her strong suit, right alongside empathy and basic human decency. "Yeah," I said, letting my voice crack slightly. I don't understand, Veronica. What did I do wrong? I tried so hard to be a good husband, to provide for Talia, to be the man you both wanted me to be. Where did I fail?" Her eyes lit up like Christmas morning, that special gleam that appears when someone who's been dying to deliver a speech finally gets their chance. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for, the opportunity to explain exactly how and why I was inadequate while I sat there and took it like the pathetic failure she believed I was. "Oh, Marcus," she sighed, settling deeper into her chair like she was preparing for a long monologue. "You didn't fail at one specific thing. You failed at being enough. You were always just average. Mediocre. Do you know how hard it was watching my daughter settle for someone like you when she could have had so much more?" "Someone like Adrian?" I prompted, playing dumb even though every word she said made me want to throw one of her expensive decorative pillows at her frozen face. "Exactly like Adrian," she said, warming to her subject like a professor who'd finally found a student interested in their boring lecture. "Now there's a man with ambition, with class, with the kind of future that my daughter deserves. He has connections, Marcus. Real connections in the business world. He's going places." "Yeah, he's going places," I thought. Like maybe prison if those fraud charges ever caught up with him. But I kept that observation to myself and instead just nodded sadly like a man accepting his inferiority. "But Talia and I had something," I said, injecting just enough desperation into my voice to sound pathetic. "We built a life together. The house, our memories, everything we worked for." "Everything she worked for, you mean?" Veronica interrupted, and there was real venom in her voice now. the kind that suggested she'd been holding back this speech for years and was finally letting it loose. Let's be honest, Marcus. You contributed what? A paycheck from a job that barely covers expenses? Some basic household maintenance. Please, Talia could have hired people for that. What she needed was a partner who could elevate her, not drag her down to your level. The recording pen in my pocket was capturing every word, every condescending syllable, and I had to resist the urge to smile, because she was giving me exactly what I needed. Her own words condemning her, her own